In October of 1777, deep within the dense wilderness of upstate New York, an empire prepared to crush a rebellion. 3,000 miles from London, the finest military machine on Earth was marching south along the Hudson River Valley to end the American Revolution once and for all. They were led by proud officers in brilliant scarlet uniforms, supported by mercenary regiments from Germany, guided by native allies, and armed with the finest weapons the industrial age could forge. Opposing them was a ragged, bleeding collection of farmers, blacksmiths, and woodsmen. They lacked uniform clothing, their supply lines were collapsing, and their political leaders were locked in bitter disputes. To every European observer, the outcome was mathematically inevitable. The rebellion would be broken, its leaders hung, and the authority of the British Crown restored across the North American continent. Yet in a single afternoon, on a patch of elevated farmland known as Bemis Heights, the fate of the Western world pivoted on the trajectory of a piece of lead no larger than a marble. According to popular history and accounts passed down across centuries, that bullet was fired from a peculiar weapon by a man perched high in a tree, aimed at a towering figure on horseback more than 300 yards away, a distance that every military manual of the 18th century declared impossible. Whether that legendary moment was a precise historic truth or a powerful narrative born from the smoke of battle, what happened on that field shattered the confidence of the British Army, sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, and changed the course of human history forever. To understand how a single long-range rifle shot could break the spine of an invading army, one must look back to the spring of 1777, when the British High Command conceived a grand strategic plan to win the war in a single season. The strategy was masterminded by Major General John Burgoyne, a charismatic, ambitious aristocrat, playwright, and politician known across London society as Gentleman Johnny. Burgoyne believed the American rebellion had a weak point, a geographic vulnerability that could be exploited to sever the North American colonies in two. That weakness was the Hudson River corridor. If a British army could march south from Canada down Lake Champlain in the Hudson Valley, while another force moved east along the Mohawk River, they would meet a third army advancing north from New York City under Sir William Howe. By establishing a chain of military posts along this north-south line, Britain would physically cut off the New England colonies, the aggressive engine of the rebellion, from the middle and southern colonies. Isolated, New England could be starved and conquered at leisure, while the rest of the colonies would be forced into submission. It was an elegant plan on paper, drafted in the comfortable parlors of Whitehall. But the men in London had designed a campaign for paper maps, oblivious to the unforgiving reality of the American wilderness. In June 1777, Burgoyne launched his expedition from Quebec with a magnificent force of nearly 8,000 men. They moved with military precision, sailing down the pristine waters of Lake Champlain. Burgoyne's army was a moving city, complete with heavy siege artillery, hundreds of baggage wagons, officers' wives, camp followers, and elaborate wardrobes. Among Burgoyne's top commanders was Brigadier General Simon Fraser, a veteran Scottish officer whose strategic brilliance, personal courage, and fierce loyalty made him the tactical heart of the British Army. At first, Burgoyne's campaign was a triumph. In July, his forces effortlessly captured Fort Ticonderoga, the formidable stronghold long considered the gateway to the northern colonies. The fall of Ticonderoga sent waves of panic through the Continental Congress. George Washington's revolution seemed to be unraveling on every front. Burgoyne sent boastful dispatches back to King George III, declaring that the rebels were in total retreat and the war was nearly won. However, as Burgoyne pushed south toward the Hudson River, his triumph began to curdle into a nightmare. The retreat of the Continental forces had brought a new commander into play, Major General Philip Schuyler, and later Major General Horatio Gates. But more importantly, the retreat brought the British face to face with the land itself. The local American militias did not attempt to engage the Redcoats in traditional open field battles. Instead, they waged a relentless war of obstruction. Tree felling axes echoed through the dense forests day and night. The Americans cut down massive ancient pines across every trail, destroyed bridges, dammed streams to create artificial swamps, and burnt crops so the invading army could find no food. A journey that should have taken 3 days took Burgoyne 3 grueling weeks. The British Army was forced to build dozens of miles of corduroy roads out of logs just to drag their heavy brass cannons through the muck. As the summer sun beat down, Burgoyne's army consumed enormous amounts of provisions while making agonizingly slow progress. Supply lines stretching back to Canada grew dangerously long and thin, subject to constant harassment by colonial guerrillas lurking in the woods. Desperate for horses to mount his German cavalry and draft animals to pull his wagon, Burgoyne made a fatal error. In August, he dispatched a detachment of 800 German and Loyalist troops to Bennington, Vermont, to raid a suspected American supply depot. Instead of finding easy plunder, the raiding party was surrounded and obliterated by New England militia led by General John Stark. Over 800 British and mercenary soldiers were killed or captured. It was a devastating blow, robbing Burgoyne of crucial manpower and vital draft animals, just as the American forces opposing him began to swell. Word of the victory at Bennington, combined with outrage over the brutal killing of a young colonial woman named Jane McCrae by native auxiliaries attached to the British Army, sparked a massive uprising across the countryside. Farmers who had previously remained neutral or indifferent grabbed their muskets, kissed their families goodbye, and marched toward the Hudson River to join the fight. At the same time, General George Washington recognized the immense danger in the North. Though tied down near Philadelphia, Washington sent crucial reinforcements to the Northern Army. Among these reinforcements was a specialized unit of marksmen unlike anything the British Army had ever encountered, the Continental Light Infantry Battalion, commanded by Colonel Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan was a legendary figure of the American frontier, standing over 6 feet tall with a massive frame and scars across his back from 100 lashes inflicted by the British military during the French and Indian War. Morgan was a man forged by hardship. His corps of 500 riflemen were recruited from the mountainous frontiers of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. These men did not carry the standard smoothbore musket used by European armies. They carried the American long rifle. The standard military musket of the era, such as the British Brown Bess, was designed for rapid loading and massed volley fire. Its barrel was smooth on the inside, meaning the lead ball bounced down the barrel upon firing and exited with unpredictable trajectory. Musket fire was notoriously inaccurate beyond 50 or 75 yards. Soldiers were instructed not to aim at individual targets, but to point their weapons in the general direction of the enemy mass and fire in synchronized volleys. The frontier long rifle was entirely different. Its barrel was longer, thinner, and contained spiral grooves cut into the interior metal, grooving known as rifling. When fired, these grooves imparted a rapid spin to the lead bullet, gyroscopically stabilizing its flight path. In the hands of a skilled frontiersman who had hunted deer and defended homesteads since childhood, a long rifle could hit a target the size of a man's head at 150 yards and strike a man-sized target at distances exceeding 300 yards. Furthermore, Morgan's men did not wear bright red or blue coats. They wore drab linen hunting shirts that blended seamlessly into the forest foliage. They did not march in rigid blocks to the sound of drums. They moved quietly through the underbrush like ghosts, communicating with one another, using calls that mimicked the calls of wild turkeys. Burgoyne's officers, accustomed to the structured, gentlemanly rules of 18th century European warfare, viewed these riflemen with a mixture of contempt and terror. To the British mind, targeted shooting of individual officers was an uncivilized form of murder. To Daniel Morgan and his men, it was simply practical arithmetic. If you kill the men giving the orders, the army stops moving. By early September, the balance of power along the Hudson River had subtly shifted. Burgoyne made a fateful decision. Knowing his supply lines to Canada were hopelessly severed, he crossed to the west bank of the Hudson River, effectively burning his bridges behind him. It was win or perish. He would drive his army south to Albany or die trying. Blocking his path was the American Northern Army, now entrenched at Bemis Heights, a series of steep bluffs overlooking the river and the main road to Albany. The defensive fortifications had been expertly engineered by a brilliant Polish military engineer named Tadeusz Kościuszko. Any army attempting to move down the river road would be trapped in a deadly crossfire between Kościuszko's artillery on the heights and American infantry in the woods below. Burgoyne realized a direct frontal assault along the river road was suicide. He decided to split his army into 3 columns and sweep inland around the American left flank, hoping to capture the high ground behind Bemis Heights. On September 19, 1777, the two armies collided for the first time near the farm of a loyalist farmer named John Freeman. The Battle of Freeman's Farm was a savage, chaotic clash in dense woods and small clearings. As the British Central Column advanced into the clearing, Morgan's riflemen opened fire from the tree line. The effect was terrifying. Within minutes, almost every British officer in the lead units had been picked off by invisible marksmen. British artillery crews were slaughtered beside their guns. The initial British charge collapsed into panic. Yet Burgoyne's second-in-command, General Simon Fraser, quickly recognized the danger. Reacting with swift tactical brilliance, Fraser stabilized the British line, maneuvering his light infantry to prevent Morgan from rolling up the flank. The battle degenerated into a brutal 4-hour slugfest. The Americans, led on the field by the fiery, impetuous Major General Benedict Arnold, repeatedly charged the British lines, only to be driven back by disciplined British bayonet counterattacks. As darkness fell, British forces barely held the field, saved only by the late arrival of German reinforcements under General Riedzel. Burgoyne claimed a technical victory because his troops remained in possession of the battlefield, but it was a Pyrrhic triumph. The British had suffered over 600 casualties, double the American losses. More importantly, Burgoyne had failed to break through the American position. Instead of pushing forward the next morning while the Americans were fatigued, Burgoyne made a decision that doomed his campaign. He received a message from General Henry Clinton in New York City, promising that a British force would soon move up the Hudson River to strike the Americans from behind. Burgoyne decided to wait. He ordered his men to dig in, constructing a network of defensive earthen redoubts across Freeman's Farm, waiting for the relief force that would never come in time. For 3 agonizing weeks, the two armies sat face to face in the crisp autumn woods, separated by less than a mile. Inside the British camp, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Provisions were cut to half rations, then to 1/3. Cold rain turned the earth into a sea of mud. Night after night, colonial militia prowled around the British perimeter, firing into the camps, killing sentries, and denying the exhausted redcoats a single hour of restful sleep. The horses were starving. Forage was gone. Disease began to spread through the trenches. Meanwhile, inside the American camp, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of surging confidence and intense personal friction. General Horatio Gates, a cautious and bureaucratically minded officer, clashed violently with Benedict Arnold. Arnold was furious that Gates had omitted his name from official reports to Congress regarding the Battle of Freeman's Farm. The argument escalated until Gates stripped Arnold of his command, ordering him to remain in his quarters. Yet while the generals squabbled, thousands of fresh American militia continued to pour into Bemis Heights every single day. By early October, the Continental forces outnumbered Burgoyne's starving army by nearly 2-1. By October 6th, Burgoyne knew he could wait no longer. His supply of food was nearly exhausted. Clinton's relief force was nowhere to be seen. Burgoyne called a council of war with his senior generals. He proposed a massive, desperate flank attack against the American lines. General Simon Fraser and General Riedzel voiced strong objections. They argued that the army was too depleted, the men too weakened by hunger, and the enemy position too strong. Fraser suggested that if they could not retreat immediately to Lake George, they should at least limit any action to a limited reconnaissance in force to test the American left flank. Burgoyne conceded. He authorized a reconnaissance force of 1,500 elite troops, a mix of British light infantry, grenadiers, and German regulars, supported by 10 field guns. On the morning of October 7, 1777, Burgoyne personally led this force out of their fortified lines and into a wheat field about 3/4 of a mile from the American defenses. The wheat had been harvested, leaving a broad expanse of open ground surrounded by thick woods. The British deployed into line, their red coats bright against the gold and brown of the autumn foliage. The officers sat atop their horses, glass telescopes in hand, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. From the high ground of Bemis Heights, American lookouts spotted the movement immediately. They rushed to inform General Gates that the British had advanced into the wheat field. Gates turned to his officers and gave a famous order. Order out Morgan to begin the game. The plan was simple, yet devastating. While American infantry regiments under General Enoch Poor attacked the British left flank and Colonel James Livingston struck the right, Daniel Morgan's riflemen would circle wide through the woods and fall upon the British right flank from behind. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Second Battle of Saratoga, also known as the Battle of Bemis Heights, exploded into violence. General Poor's New Hampshire militia marched up the slope toward the British left flank, where the British grenadiers under Major John Dyke Ackland were waiting. The grenadiers opened fire with a thunderous volley, but their aim was high, bullets tearing harmlessly through the tree branches above the advancing Americans. The Continentals held their fire until they were within 50 yards, then delivered a lethal volley directly into the British line. Major Ackland fell, severely wounded in both legs. The grenadiers broke and fled in confusion. Simultaneously, on the British right flank, Daniel Morgan's riflemen struck like a thunderbolt. Emerging from the woods, they poured a devastating fire into the British light infantry commanded by Major Alexander Lindsay, the Earl of Balcarres. The sudden, intense fire from an unexpected direction threw the British flank into utter chaos. Within 30 minutes of the first shot, the British reconnaissance force was collapsing on both wings. The center of the line was caving in, and the battery of artillery was on the verge of being captured. It was at this critical moment that Brigadier General Simon Fraser stepped into the center of the storm. Fraser was 51 years old, a veteran of battles across Europe and North America. He was universally admired by his men for his courage and coolness under fire. Mounted on a splendid gray charger, wearing a conspicuous full-dress uniform, Fraser rode back and forth along the crumbling line. Wherever the line buckled, Fraser appeared. He rallied retreating soldiers, reorganized broken units, and personally directed counterfire. Under his inspiring leadership, the British light infantry stopped their retreat, turned, and formed a new line of defense. If Fraser could hold this position for just a few more minutes, Burgoyne's troops could complete an orderly retreat back into the safety of their fortified redoubts. If he failed, the entire detachment would be annihilated, opening the road for the Americans to storm the main British camp. Observing the battle through his spyglass from the edge of the tree line, Daniel Morgan saw what was happening. He recognized that as long as Simon Fraser remained on his horse, the British army would not break. Fraser was the glue holding the entire enterprise together. Morgan turned to a group of his best marksmen standing nearby. Among them was Timothy Murphy, a 26-year-old rifleman from Pennsylvania. Murphy was a man of Irish descent who had spent years on the frontier. He was already famous among his peers for his legendary marksmanship and his possession of a rare double-barreled rifle, a weapon that allowed him to fire 2 shots without reloading. Morgan pointed across the smoke-filled field toward the gray horse and the officer in the brilliant uniform. According to traditional accounts recorded in early American histories, Morgan spoke words that would be echoing down through military legend. That gallant officer is General Fraser. I admire him, but it is necessary that he should die. Take your station in that cluster of bushes and do your duty. Historical consensus today treats the precise wording of Morgan's command and the exact identity of the gunman as a compelling blend of contemporary account and romantic national legend. Several riflemen were instructed to target the British officer, and multiple shots were fired simultaneously through the gloom. But across the centuries, it is the name of Timothy Murphy that became permanently attached to the shot that broke an empire. What is beyond dispute is what happened next in the wheat field. Timothy Murphy climbed high into the branches of a large oak tree to get a clear line of sight over the billowing clouds of gun smoke hanging over the battlefield. The distance between his perch and General Fraser was estimated to be roughly 300 yards, nearly 3 football fields in length. At 300 yards, an ordinary soldier carrying a smoothbore musket would not even attempt a shot. The probability of striking a specific man at that distance was close to 0. But Murphy was holding a rifle, and he was a master of his craft. He accounted for the autumn wind, the drop of the heavy lead bullet over the distance, and the movement of the horse. Murphy took aim and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. A few yards from General Fraser, the bullet struck the pommel of an aide-de-camp saddle, cutting through the leather. Fraser's aides immediately recognized that the general was being targeted by an expert sniper. They urged him to fall back out of range or at least cover his bright uniform. Fraser refused, stating that his duty required him to remain where his men could see him. Seconds later, a second shot cut through the air. The lead ball passed through the mane of Fraser's gray horse, missing the general by mere inches. Once again, his officers begged him to take cover. Once again, Fraser stood firm, reining his horse in to give another order to a battery of artillery. Murphy loaded a third time. He wiped the sweat from his eyes, adjusted his aim slightly higher to compensate for the distance, and pulled the trigger. Across the field, General Simon Fraser suddenly gasped and reeled backward in his saddle. The bullet had struck him squarely in the abdomen, passing completely through his body. Hands reached out to catch the fallen general before he hit the ground. A group of devastated soldiers lifted their wounded commander and began carrying him back toward the British lines. The effect of Fraser's fall on the British troops was immediate and catastrophic. Word spread like wildfire down the line. General Fraser is down! The courage that had held the British formation together vanished in an instant. The soldiers who had stood firm against overwhelming numbers only minutes before were seized by panic. They broke ranks and fled in wild confusion toward their fortified camps, abandoning their artillery pieces and their wounded comrades on the field. Just as the British line dissolved into chaos, a new force appeared on the battlefield to turn the retreat into a rout. General Benedict Arnold, unable to endure sitting idly in his tent while the battle raged, had mounted his horse and ridden onto the field in direct defiance of General Gates's orders. Arnold possessed no official command, but his presence was magnetic. Riding to the front of the American infantry, Arnold waved his sword and shouted, "Follow me, boys!" The troops cheered wildly and followed Arnold as he spearheaded a violent, relentless charge against the fleeing British. Arnold drove his men straight at the British right flank, targeting a heavily fortified earthen redoubt held by German mercenaries under Colonel Heinrich von Bremen. The Bremen redoubt was a formidable position, protected by high timber walls and trench lines. German soldiers poured a heavy fire into the advancing Continentals, but Arnold was unstoppable. He galloped his horse straight through a sally port into the interior of the redoubt, firing his pistol into the defenders. Encouraged by his insane bravery, American soldiers swarmed over the walls. Colonel Bremen was shot dead by his own men as he attempted to force them to stand their ground. The redoubt fell. During the final moments of the assault, Arnold's horse was shot out from under him. As the horse collapsed, a bullet shattered Arnold's leg, the same leg that had been wounded during the American assault on Quebec 2 years earlier. As he lay pinned under his dead horse, an American soldier ran up to bayonet the German soldier who had shot Arnold. Arnold shouted, "Don't hurt him, he's a fine fellow!" Though seriously wounded, Arnold had achieved a masterstroke. By capturing the Bremen redoubt, the Americans had breached the entire British defensive line. They now held the key terrain overlooking the main British camp. Darkness alone saved Burgoyne's army from complete destruction that night. While Arnold was carried off the field on a litter, General Simon Fraser lay dying inside a small farmhouse behind the British lines, known as the Taylor House. The house belonged to a local woman, Baroness Frederica von Riedesel, the brave wife of the German commander, who had brought her young children to North America to accompany her husband. In her vivid memoirs, the Baroness recorded the agonizing final hours of General Fraser. Fraser was laid upon a table in the room where the Baroness and her children had planned to dine. He was in immense pain, fully aware that his wound was fatal. Throughout the night, as the sounds of distant gunfire flickered through the forest, Fraser repeatedly mourned his fate, whispering, "Oh, fatal ambition! Poor General Burgoyne! My poor wife." At 8 o'clock on the morning of October 8, 1777, General Simon Fraser passed away. In accordance with his dying wishes, he was buried at sunset on top of a prominent hill overlooking the Hudson River, inside a redoubt the British had constructed. As the British chaplain read the funeral service over Fraser's grave, American artillery batteries across the river, unaware that a funeral was taking place, observed a group of British officers gathering on the hill and opened fire. Cannonballs kicked up dirt around the grave and struck near the grieving officers. Yet the chaplain continued reading the service without pausing, his voice steady despite the explosions. Baroness Riedesel later wrote that the sight of Fraser's burial under enemy fire was one of the most solemn and terrifying moments of her life. With Fraser dead, his redoubts compromised, and his army surrounded by over 20,000 American troops, Major General John Burgoyne was trapped. He ordered a retreat north toward the town of Saratoga, hoping to cross the Hudson and escape to Canada. But it was too late. The heavy rains turned the roads into liquid mud, slowing the exhausted army to a crawl. American militia had already secured the river crossings ahead of him, cutting off every avenue of escape. By October 13th, Burgoyne's army was completely encircled. They were out of food, out of water, and exposed to continuous sniper and artillery fire from every direction. Burgoyne called a final council of war. His officers unanimously agreed. There was no hope of relief, no possibility of fighting their way out. Negotiation was the only option. On October 17, 1777, a historic event took place that sent shockwaves around the globe. General John Burgoyne surrendered his entire army to General Horatio Gates. Nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms on the green fields along the Hudson River. In a gesture of formal 18th century military etiquette, Burgoyne unbuckled his dress sword and handed it to Gates, saying, "The fortune of war has made me your prisoner." Gates, maintaining a respectful demeanor, handed the sword back, replying, "I shall always be ready to bear testimony that it has not been by any fault of your excellency." The news of the American victory at Saratoga acted as a thunderclap across the civilized world. In London, King George III was reported to have fallen into a deep depression upon hearing that an entire British army had surrendered to colonial rebels. Members of Parliament openly questioned whether the war could ever be won. In Paris, the news changed the course of world history. For 2 years, the French government had been secretly sending money and supplies to the American rebels, eager to weaken their arch-rival Great Britain. But King Louis XVI had hesitated to enter the war openly, fearing that the American rebellion would collapse before France could mobilize. Saratoga was the definitive proof the French had been waiting for. It proved that the Continental Army was capable of capturing an entire British army in the field. In February 1778, Benjamin Franklin, serving as the American ambassador in Paris, signed the Treaty of Alliance with France. France formally declared war on Great Britain, providing the fledgling United States with vital naval support, professional troops, heavy artillery, and financial backing. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon joined the conflict against Britain as well. What had begun as a local colonial rebellion was transformed overnight into a global conflict. The British Empire was suddenly forced to fight on multiple fronts across the globe, in the Caribbean, in Europe, in India, and on the high seas. Never again could Britain concentrate its full military power against North America. 4 years after Saratoga, French ships blocked the Chesapeake Bay, while American and French troops trapped Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia, forcing the second major surrender of a British army and securing American independence. Military historians have long debated the precise impact of individual moments in major battles. Was it Benedict Arnold's reckless charge that won the day at Saratoga? Was it Horatio Gates's patient organizational work? Was it Daniel Morgan's tactical brilliance? Or was it the tragic loss of General Simon Fraser? The truth is that history is a tapestry woven from all these threads. Yet, human memory naturally anchors itself to vivid, singular moments where the vast machinery of history condenses into a single point of time. The shot fired at Simon Fraser on October 7, 1777, is one of those timeless moments. Whether the bullet was delivered by the hands of Timothy Murphy or another rifleman concealed in the autumn woods, that single strike tore through more than just a British general. It shattered the tactical command of an invading army, destroyed the illusion of British military invincibility, and set off a chain reaction that birthed a new republic. Today, if you walk through the quiet battlefield of Saratoga, the woods are still, save for the rustle of autumn leaves falling onto the quiet earth. Near the site of the old Bremen Redoubt, a monument stands in memory of the battle. Curiously, there is a stone monument on the battlefield dedicated to Benedict Arnold, but it does not bear his name. Because he later betrayed the American cause, the monument simply depicts a boot, commemorating the wounded leg of the hero who led the charge that day, while erasing the name of the traitor he later became. And a short distance away, near the wheat field where the red lines once stood, local tradition marks the general location of the oak tree where a rifleman took aim through the smoke of battle. It remains a profound reminder of how fragile the fate of nations can be. A reminder that behind grand strategic plans, powerful empires, and sweeping political movements, history is ultimately shaped by human choices, extraordinary courage, and sometimes a single piece of lead flying through a quiet autumn sky.